The winter of 1859 lay heavy over Washington, D.C., settling across the city like a soft woolen blanket forgotten on the back of an antique chair. It muted the clatter of carriage wheels, softened the harshness of the cobblestones, and wrapped the capital in a quiet, almost contemplative stillness. The daylight, brief as a sigh, faded quickly behind gray clouds, and warm lamps shone behind frosted window panes like small, golden promises of refuge. For most people, it was simply winter. But for those who moved in the political circles of the nation's capital, the snow seemed to symbolize something else entirely, something colder, heavier, and spreading more quickly than anyone wished to acknowledge. Washington had always been a city of voices. Its chambers, corridors, and kitchens were filled with talk of laws, talk of futures, talk of imagined glories and feared disasters. But now the loud talk had faded. In its place came whispers, soft, careful, choiceful whispers shared in warm parlors after supper, spoken behind half-closed doors or over slowly cooling cups of tea. These whispers were not idle. They were not gossip. They were the shape of fear, drifting gently but steadily through the capital. The parlor of Margaret Eaton Whitford's townhouse was one of the places where such whispers gathered like invisible guests. Located along Massachusetts Avenue, the house looked modest from the outside, but inside, its rooms glowed with quiet elegance. It was not a place of loud music or raucous laughter. It was a place of velvet furniture, lace curtains, and conversations that mattered. Margaret Whitford herself was a widow in her mid-40s, the kind of woman who carried herself with a calm confidence that made her both respected and slightly feared. Her gatherings were never frivolous. When she hosted an evening, it was because something important was rising like a tide in the nation's bloodstream, and she intended to understand it before the storm broke. On a particular Thursday evening in early December 1859, her parlor was warm with firelight as she welcomed a small but carefully curated group of guests. Snowflakes clung like small pearls to the coats of those who entered, melting into the rich red carpeting. The scent of spiced cider drifted through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of burning pine logs. Senator Thomas Claiborne arrived first. He was a tall man with slightly tired eyes, the kind that came from reading too many reports late at night under lamplight. He removed his gloves and scanned the room with a slow, habitual glance, taking note of who had already arrived and who was still expected. He had learned in his decades of service that who appeared in a room sometimes mattered more than what they said. Shortly behind him entered Senator Marcus Ellery of Massachusetts, a fiercely intelligent man whose voice was sharp, but whose manner remained courteous. He believed in abolishing slavery with a conviction that made him both admired and despised. When he stepped inside, the cold outside seemed to retreat from him like a scolded pet. Next was Colonel Adrian Holt, a tall Virginian with a proud bearing and a calm, almost stoic face. He represented the interests of plantation owners and carried himself with the careful patience of a man accustomed to defending his position with politeness that hid steel beneath. Evelyn Caraway arrived quietly, a journalist whose ability to hear what others missed made her a rare presence in such a gathering. She was not loud, nor pushy, but she listened with an attentiveness that made people forget they were being observed. Lastly came Congressman Nathaniel Breen, a soft-spoken man whose silence was often misunderstood for timidity. In truth, Breen heard everything, remembered everything, and rarely revealed the depth of his understanding. Margaret welcomed each guest with polite warmth, her smile gentle and her gestures graceful. The fire crackled softly as they all found places around her elegant parlor. The first half hour of conversation drifted in comfortable generalities: weather, travel delays, small observations about the recent congressional session. But underneath it all lay the same current of tension, subtle but undeniable. Margaret finally broke through it with her poised, steady voice. "Gentlemen, and dear Evelyn, thank you for coming tonight. I believe we all feel something stirring in the air, something uneasy." Her words brought a hush over the room, as though the very walls leaned closer to listen. Claiborne spoke first, his tone low. "The incident at Harper's Ferry has unsettled more than the newspapers will ever admit." Ellery nodded. "John Brown's raid was the spark, but the dry grass has been accumulating for years." Colonel Holt shifted slightly. "Harper's Ferry was madness. No one in the South believed that man represented anything but lunacy." Ellery's eyes glinted. Sometimes lunacy and conviction walk the same road. Margaret raised her hand, gently pressing the conversation back to calm. "We are here not to debate John Brown, but to understand what comes next." The fire popped softly, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney.
It was then that the front door opened again. Margaret smiled knowingly. Ah, our final guest. Jonathan Whitcomb entered, a lean man with intense eyes, carrying the air of someone accustomed to moving through the unseen corridors of political power. Officially a clerk, unofficially far more, he was the kind of man who delivered information like a surgeon making a precise incision. He brushed snow from his shoulders before speaking. "I've just come from the Treasury building," he said, voice low but clear. "There is something you should all hear." The room fell completely still. Whitcomb continued, "South Carolina is drafting documents, not discussions, documents, preparing for the possibility of leaving the Union." Colonel Holt stiffened. "Drafts mean nothing." Whitcomb met his gaze calmly. "They mean intent." A faint breath of cold seemed to drift through the warm room. From that moment on, the parlor became a quiet theater of uneasy truths. Claiborne leaned forward. "If South Carolina secedes, others will follow." Ellery exhaled slowly. "And once the line breaks, it will break quickly." Holt's jaw tightened. "The South wishes only to protect its rights. Secession is not desired, but it will not be threatened." Margaret listened, her expression thoughtful. "Fear is growing on both sides," she murmured. "Fear is the most dangerous influence in politics." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice soft. "Fear spreads faster than fact." Her words hung gently in the air, absorbed into the dim lamplight. The conversation shifted into a slower, more somber rhythm. Claiborne described conversations he had overheard in congressional corridors, quiet but charged. Ellery spoke of letters from Massachusetts, filled with anxiety. Holt shared whispers from Richmond that suggested people were preparing for the worst long before the newspapers would dare to admit it. The more they spoke, the more the room came to feel like the center of a quiet storm, where the winds were not violent, but insistent. As the evening stretched deeper into night, Margaret invited the group to move into a smaller sitting room, where candlelight softened the shadows further. They spoke not of strategy or legislation, but of people, ordinary citizens whose lives were entangled in decisions made far above their reach. Breen spoke of a young soldier he had met in Virginia, who admitted he would fight, but did not know why. Ellery shared a letter from a school teacher who feared her students were learning hatred faster than arithmetic. Evelyn detailed a story she planned to publish of a family divided across state lines, unsure whether to gather for Christmas at all. Their voices drifted together like threads forming a tapestry. No raised tempers, no declarations of certainty. Just the slow, heavy understanding that a nation was slipping toward an uncertain horizon, guided not by bold speeches, but by quiet, accumulating whispers. Margaret poured tea for her guests, the gentle clink of porcelain blending with the soft cadence of discussion. She understood better than most that great turning points seldom begin with noise. They begin with a shift in tone, a subtle change in posture, a whisper uttered in just the right room. Her parlor on this cold winter night was such a room. As the hours slipped deeper into night, the fire burned low, casting longer shadows. Claiborne stared into the embers, wondering how many more winters would pass before peace became a memory. Holt gazed out the window, the falling snow reminding him of the cotton fields back home. Ellery rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of moral conflict pressing upon him like the winter air. When the clock chimed 11, the conversation softened again, returning to small comments about the cold and the lateness of the hour. But beneath the polite farewells, each guest carried away something unspoken, a recognition that the nation stood at the edge of a shifting season, one that would change its character forever. As they prepared to leave, Margaret walked them to the doorway. The wind had quieted, and the street was blanketed in fresh snow, glowing faintly under the distant lamplights. Holt paused before stepping out. "Do you believe war is coming, Mrs. Whitford?" he asked quietly. Margaret's gaze drifted to the dark horizon. "I believe," she said slowly, "that whispers become storms when too many people refuse to listen." Ellery nodded, as though he had expected no other answer. One by one, they stepped into the cold night. Their silhouettes faded into the snowy darkness, each lost in thought. When the last guest had gone, Margaret returned to her parlor alone. The fire had nearly died, leaving the room in a soft, fading glow. She settled into her favorite chair and listened to the quiet of her home, feeling the weight of history pressing gently against the silence.